The historic confrontation when Jonathan Roumie faced Charlie Kirk. Jonathan Roumie was about to speak 7 words that would forever change Charlie Kirk's life. But neither of them saw it coming. Charlie had just unleashed what he thought would be the perfect blow to expose the man who plays Jesus on television as weak. The cameras were rolling. 12 million people were watching. And Charlie was confident he had cornered him with the cruelest question he could devise. But Jonathan's response would shock everyone in that studio. What were those 7 words that silenced Charlie Kirk? What could the man who portrays Christ possibly say that 3 major networks would later try to bury the footage? This is the story of the most explosive interview in television history. The moment when unshakable faith collided with a political empire. And it all started when Charlie Kirk made the fatal mistake of challenging the wrong person on the wrong day. 3 weeks earlier, Jonathan Roumie was sitting in his modest Chicago apartment reading his morning prayers when his phone rang with an invitation that would test everything he believed. The voice on the other end belonged to Turning Point USA's head producer, offering him a spot on what they called a Faith and Freedom Summit, featuring various Christian leaders and conservatives. Jonathan had heard about Charlie Kirk's events, the political rallies disguised as spiritual revivals, the way he turned the cross into a flag in the culture war. He almost declined, but something in his spirit told him this was where God wanted him to be. The apartment around him told the real story of his faith, walls bare, except for a wooden crucifix his Lebanese grandmother had carved. A faded photo of his father who had died thinking his son would never amount to anything. And stacks of theology books worn from years of study. His kitchen table was covered with letters from viewers of The Chosen. People writing to thank him for showing them what authentic faith looked like in a world full of spiritual counterfeits. Jonathan had never sought fame, never chased fortune, and had turned down countless opportunities to monetize his portrayal of Jesus. But this invitation felt different, like a calling he couldn't ignore. As he prepared for the show, Jonathan researched Charlie Kirk's recent events and felt his heart break for the millions of people being sold a version of Jesus tied to partisan politics. Charlie's Faith and Freedom Summit cost $500 per person, promising to equip believers to win the culture war and take back America for God. His media platform had created an empire worth tens of millions, all built on the idea that Christianity was about political power, not love and service. Jonathan knew he was walking into a trap, but he also knew that sometimes God calls his people to be lights in the darkness, even when it costs them everything. The night before the taping, Jonathan knelt on his apartment floor and prayed for wisdom, courage, and the grace to speak truth with love. He thought about Jesus washing the disciples' feet, eating with tax collectors and sinners, healing on the Sabbath despite religious leaders' opposition. He thought about the woman at the well, the Good Samaritan, the thief on the cross, all the people rejected by society but welcomed by Jesus. Jonathan made peace with the possibility that this appearance might end his career, because some truths were worth telling regardless of the cost. When Jonathan arrived at Turning Point USA Studios the next morning, he was struck by the combative atmosphere that pervaded everything. Massive American flags, banners reading, "Faith, Family, Freedom," and walls lined with photos of Charlie with politicians and conservative leaders. The green room was filled with other political commentators, each one discussing strategies to win the next election and take back culture from progressives. He sat quietly in the corner, reading his worn copy of the Gospel of Luke, while around him people discussed polling data, advertising campaigns, and how to mobilize Christian voters. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. A production assistant approached Jonathan with a clipboard outlining the questions Charlie would ask and coaching him on how to inspire the conservative base. "Make sure you emphasize the importance of electing Christian leaders," she said with practiced efficiency. Charlie's audience wants to hear that faith and politics are inseparable. Jonathan politely declined to review the suggested talking points, explaining that he wasn't there to campaign politically. The assistant looked confused, as if she had never encountered someone who didn't want to use this platform for political purposes. As the other guests took the stage before him, Jonathan watched from the wings as Charlie interviewed a series of conservatives talking about saving America from Marxism, defending Christian values in government, and fighting against fake wokeness. Each segment felt like a carefully choreographed political rally, with Charlie skillfully guiding the conversation toward action and victory. The audience responded with combative enthusiasm, clearly hungry for meaning and purpose, but being offered politics instead of gospel. Jonathan felt the weight of what he was about to face, knowing that his message of loving enemies and serving the poor would be jarring in this context. When his time came, Jonathan walked onto the stage wearing his father's old blazer and carrying nothing but his Bible. No promotional materials, no American flag, no agenda except to speak truth. Charlie greeted him with the characteristic enthusiasm of a talk show host. But Jonathan could see the calculation behind his smile as he sized him up for the interview. The audience applauded politely, but there was an expectant energy in the room, as if they sensed something different about this guest. Jonathan took his seat and quietly asked God for the words that would honor his name and serve these precious people who were searching for something real. Charlie opened with his usual approach, praising Jonathan's work on The Chosen and asking about his role in the Christian revival in America. "Jonathan, you've inspired millions of Americans with your portrayal of Jesus," he began, his voice carrying the decisiveness that had made him famous. "Tell us how you see your role in the fight to take back America for God." Jonathan paused, recognizing the political framework he was trying to impose on his faith. He knew this was his first choice: play along with his language or speak the truth that might alienate his audience. "Charlie, I appreciate the question, but I have to be honest," Jonathan replied gently. "I don't think Jesus came to take back America or any nation. He came to seek and save the lost." The shift in the room was palpable. Charlie's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, and several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the Christian nationalism they had expected. Jonathan continued, "Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. He made that clear. My job isn't to make America great again, but to point people to the only one who is great." Charlie recovered quickly, his debate skills kicking in as he attempted to steer the conversation back to safer territory. "That's beautiful, Jonathan. But surely you agree that we need Christian leaders in government, that faith and politics must go together to protect our values." His words were carefully chosen to make the gospel sound like a political agenda. But Jonathan had spent years studying theology, and he recognized the subtle way he was trying to dilute his message. He also recognized that this moment would define everything that followed. "Charlie, I think we need to distinguish between being a Christian in politics and turning Christianity into politics," Jonathan said, his voice remaining calm but firm. Jesus never sought political power. When people wanted to crown him king, he withdrew. When Peter drew his sword to defend him, he told him to put it away. The audience was completely silent now, sensing that something significant was happening. Charlie's expression hardened slightly, the confidence in his eyes replaced by something sharper. He had built an empire on the idea that Christianity and political power must be intertwined. And Jonathan had just challenged the foundation of his entire worldview. "Jonathan, surely you don't mean to suggest that Christians should stay out of politics?" Charlie's tone remained controlled, but there was an edge to it. "Isn't that very passivity what allowed the enemy to destroy our Christian culture?" The question was loaded, designed to make Jonathan look weak and passive in front of his audience. But Jonathan had faced this challenge many times before, and he knew the difference between speaking truth and being cruel. His response would either open hearts or close them, and he prayed for wisdom in that crucial moment. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his voice filled with genuine compassion. "Charlie, I never said Christians should stay out of politics. But I worry when we make politics our God. When winning elections becomes more important than loving our neighbor. When defeating political enemies becomes the mission instead of sharing the gospel." He paused, looking out at the audience with the same gentle expression he wore when portraying Jesus. Jesus said we would be known by our love, not by our political victories. He said to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us, not defeat them in a culture war. The analogy was simple but powerful, and Jonathan could see some audience members nodding in understanding, despite the uncomfortable tension in the room. Charlie's mask was beginning to slip now, his frustration with Jonathan's refusal to conform to his political framework becoming more apparent. "But Jonathan, don't we have a responsibility to confront evil, to fight against those who want to destroy Christian values?" His voice carried an urgent tone, as if calling people to battle. The audience began to murmur in agreement, some clearly uncomfortable with Jonathan's talk of loving enemies. But Jonathan had been preparing for this moment his entire life, even if he didn't know it. "Charlie, I'm not saying we don't confront evil, but our weapons are not the weapons of this world," Jonathan replied, his voice growing stronger. "Paul made it clear we fight not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual powers and forces. Our enemy isn't progressives or Democrats. It's sin, death, and the devil." The words hit the room like a physical force, and Jonathan could see Charlie's eyes narrow as he realized he was talking about his empire. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word of what had become a theological wrestling match with enormous stakes. Jonathan knew he was about to cross a line that would change everything. The Jesus I follow didn't come to win the culture war or build a political empire. Jonathan continued, his voice filled with quiet passion. He came to seek and save the lost. He ate with tax collectors that religious leaders hated. He healed Gentiles that Jews despised. He died for sinners while we were still his enemies. The words hung in the air like an indictment of everything Charlie had built. He sat rigid in his chair, his public persona warring with his private rage at being challenged so directly. The cameras captured every micro-expression, every moment of his carefully controlled composure beginning to crack. Charlie decided to go for the kill, leaning forward with the debating instinct that had made him one of the most influential people in the conservative movement. "Jonathan, let's be honest about something. You've made millions of dollars playing Jesus on a television show, but how do you actually live? Have you really given up everything to follow Jesus? Or are you just playing that role on screen?" The attack was swift and personal, designed to expose him as a hypocrite and regain control of the narrative. The audience perked up, sensing blood in the water. But Charlie had just made a fatal mistake. He had attacked Jonathan's integrity without knowing the truth about his life. Jonathan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn from handling. "Charlie, you're absolutely right to question that," he said calmly. "In fact, I brought my financial statements for exactly this reason." He held up the paper toward the camera. "This is my bank statement from last month. My balance is $1,847. I give away everything except what I need to survive." The audience gasped audibly and Charlie's face went pale. This wasn't in his script, wasn't part of the narrative he had prepared to destroy him with. Jonathan continued, "I live in the same apartment I've had for 8 years. Drive a 15-year-old Honda. and eat most of my meals at home because that's all I can afford. I don't have a security team. No political consultants. No PAC raising money for me. The revelation sent shockwaves through the studio. But Jonathan wasn't finished. You see, Charlie, when Jesus called his disciples, he told them to take nothing for the journey. When he sent them out, he said, "Go as sheep among wolves, not as warriors into battle." His voice grew more passionate, more urgent. He said his kingdom advances through love and service, not through political power and cultural victory. He said the first will be last, and those who want to be great must be servants of all. The words hit Charlie like physical blows, each one exposing the vast difference between his Christian nationalism and the radical teachings of Christ. Charlie's composure was cracking now, his voice rising with barely controlled anger. That's easy to say when you don't have to fight every day to protect the faith from those who want to destroy it. While you play Jesus in a safe studio, some of us are on the front lines fighting for religious freedom. The outburst was unprecedented. Charlie Kirk, the culture warrior, losing control on his own show. The audience sat in stunned silence as they watched their beloved host reveal a side of himself they had never seen. But Jonathan remained completely calm, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. "Charlie, I'm not playing Jesus in a safe studio," Jonathan said quietly. "I'm trying to do what he did, go to the wounded, the rejected, the forgotten by both political sides." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And about the front lines you mentioned, I wonder if we're fighting the right battle. Jesus said our greatest battle is against pride and self-love in our own hearts, not against neighbors who vote differently than us." The parallel was devastating, and Jonathan could see the recognition dawning in Charlie's eyes. He had built an empire on mobilizing Christians to fight external enemies. But he was pointing out that the greatest enemy might be within. The tension in the studio was suffocating as Charlie realized he was losing control of his own show. His audience was listening to Jonathan with the kind of attention usually reserved for him, hanging on his words as he spoke about faith with an authenticity they rarely encountered. "You know what I think, Jonathan," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "I think you're weak, hiding behind love and kindness while our civilization is being destroyed. I think you're dangerous because you're making Christianity soft." The attack was desperate now. A warrior accustomed to winning, facing defeat. But Jonathan's response would be the moment that changed everything. Jonathan stood up slowly, and the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. "Charlie, 3 days ago, I got a call from a little boy named Michael in Detroit. He's 7 years old, and he's dying of leukemia." His voice was steady but filled with emotion. "His mother told me that he watches The Chosen every day in his hospital bed, and that it's the only thing that gives him peace. She asked if I could talk to him just for a few minutes." The audience was completely silent now, sensing that something profound was about to happen. Even Charlie sat frozen, his anger replaced by a growing sense of dread. "Michael asked me if Jesus really loves little boys who are sick. If heaven is real, if his mommy and daddy will be okay when he dies." Jonathan continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I told him yes. Jesus loves him more than he can imagine. That heaven is more beautiful than any place he could dream of. And that his parents will see him again someday." Tears were starting to flow in the audience now, and even some of the camera operators were visibly moved. Jonathan looked directly at Charlie. "Then Michael asked me something that broke my heart. He asked if the man on TV who always talks about fighting really knows how much Jesus loves, or if he only knows Jesus who fights." The words hit Charlie like a sledgehammer, and for the first time in the interview, he was completely speechless. A 7-year-old dying child had seen through to his essence with the clarity that only innocence possesses. The audience began to murmur, some crying openly as they recognized the truth in the child's observation. Jonathan continued, I told Michael that only God knows what's in someone's heart, but that he should pray for everyone who talks about Jesus on television. Because sometimes adults forget that Jesus came not to win, but to love. The simplicity and innocence of the story was devastating in its power to expose the difference between politicized faith and the simple love of Christ. Charlie's hands were shaking now, his usual confidence completely shattered. That's emotional manipulation, he stammered. But his voice lacked conviction. He looked out at his audience and saw something he had never seen before, people looking at him with disappointment. Even pity. They were seeing him clearly for the first time. And he didn't like what they were discovering. Jonathan shook his head sadly. No, Charlie, that's just a little boy who knows the difference between Jesus of love and Jesus of power. Children can see things that adults often miss because their hearts haven't been clouded by politics and ambition. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras seemed loud. Jonathan reached into his other pocket and pulled out his phone. Charlie, Michael is watching this show right now from his hospital bed. His mother texted me this morning to tell me he was excited to see Jesus on TV with the strong man who talks about faith. He held up the phone so he could see the message. Would you like me to call him so you can tell him yourself that loving enemies is weakness, so you can explain to a dying 7-year-old that Jesus came to win the culture war, not to save souls? The challenge hung in the air like a sword over Charlie's head. Charlie's face went white as the full implications of the moment hit him. Here was a child facing death with faith and hope. And he had just spent the last 30 minutes attacking the very nature of that hope. The audience was watching him with a mixture of expectation and growing horror as they realized what was being asked of him. I can't, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The admission was devastating. The man who had built an empire on strength and victory couldn't bring himself to tell a dying child that loving others was weakness. Jonathan's voice became incredibly gentle, filled with the compassion of someone who understood both the weight of truth and the pain of confronting it. Charlie, I don't think you want to hurt Michael or anyone else for that matter. I think you genuinely want to serve God and protect the faith. He paused, looking at him with the same expression Jesus wore when he looked at Peter after he denied him 3 times. But somewhere along the way, I think you started believing that God's kingdom advances through political power and cultural victory. That you could force people to become Christians through laws and elections. The words were like a surgical knife cutting through years of self-deception and rationalization. The problem is, Jonathan continued, Jesus didn't come to rule by power. He came to rule by love. He didn't force anyone to follow him. He invited. It didn't conquer enemies. He died for them. His voice grew stronger, more urgent. And when we turn Christianity into a political movement, when we measure success by electoral victories instead of transformed souls, we've lost what made it good news in the first place. Each word was like a hammer blow against the foundation of Charlie's political empire. And he sat frozen as his worldview crumbled in real time. The audience was completely transfixed, many of them crying as they recognized the truth in Jonathan's words. These were people who had spent years fighting the culture war, and they were beginning to understand that they might have won some battles but lost their souls. Jonathan looked out at them with infinite compassion. You don't need to win the culture war to prove Jesus is Lord, he said gently. You don't need political power to live out the gospel. You just need to love your neighbor as yourself, even when they vote differently than you. Charlie finally found his voice, but it was broken and desperate. But if we don't fight, we'll lose everything. The culture will completely turn away from God. The questions were plaintive. The cry of someone whose entire identity was being dismantled. Jonathan's expression softened even further. "Charlie, I understand that fear, but Jesus never promised we would win the culture. He promised he would build his church, and the gates of hell would not prevail against it. The question isn't whether we'll win this country," Jonathan continued. "The question is whether we'll live like Jesus while we try. Whether we love our enemies or hate them. Whether we serve the poor or use them for political purposes." The distinction was crucial. And as it landed, Charlie's face crumpled as he realized the answer. For years, he had positioned himself as a warrior for God. But somewhere along the way, winning had become more important than loving. The recognition was devastating. The silence stretched on as Charlie wrestled with the implications of Jonathan's words. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked the question that would change everything. "What if you're right? What if I've turned faith into a weapon instead of living it out?" The vulnerability in his voice was shocking. This was Charlie Kirk, one of the most powerful culture warriors, admitting the possibility that his entire campaign might have been misdirected. The audience held its breath, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in television history. Jonathan's response was immediate and filled with hope. Then, the same grace that saved a broken actor from New York can save a culture warrior from Arizona. The same Jesus who washed the disciples' feet can teach us that serving is more important than winning. He took a step closer to his chair. "Charlie, the beautiful thing about Jesus is that he doesn't require you to get all your politics right before you come to him. He just asks you to love like he loves." The offer of grace hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in the ocean of their own making. And then it happened. The moment that would be replayed millions of times across social media and talked about for years to come. Charlie Kirk, the culture warrior always so strong, stood up from his chair and walked over to Jonathan Roumie. Without saying a word, he knelt down beside him, tears streaming down his face as years of fighting and hardness crumbled away. "I don't know how to stop fighting," he whispered. "I don't know how to just love." The admission was devastating in its honesty, and the audience watched in stunned silence as their fighting host revealed himself to be lost and needing help. Jonathan knelt down beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "That's exactly where Jesus wants you to be," he said softly. "At the end of your own fighting, ready to learn how to love instead of conquer." He looked out at the audience, many of whom were crying openly now. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Not those who win the culture war, not those with the most political victories, but the peacemakers. The words were revolutionary in this context. The idea that peace was more important than victory, that love was the path to real change. "Charlie," Jonathan said, his voice filled with tenderness, "would you like me to pray with you?" The question was simple, but it represented everything. The surrender of fighting, the acknowledgement of need, the first step toward authentic faith instead of politicized faith. Charlie nodded, unable to speak through his tears. As Jonathan began to pray, something extraordinary happened in that studio. The fighting fell away. The performance ended. And for the first time in Turning Point USA Studios history, real worship began to take place. "Jesus," Jonathan prayed, "here is your son Charlie. He's tired of fighting. He wants to know you, not use you for political victory." The prayer was simple and honest, without the fighting language or manipulative tactics. As Jonathan prayed, Charlie began to sob, not the controlled tears of a warrior, but the raw, ugly crying of someone whose heart was breaking open. He was mourning the years of fighting enemies instead of loving them. Building an empire instead of building the kingdom. The audience watched in amazement as their hero revealed himself to be as human and needy as they were. And many of them began to pray along. When the prayer ended, Charlie remained on his knees for a long moment, as if afraid to return to the reality of an empire built on fighting. Finally, he looked up at Jonathan with eyes that held something they hadn't contained in years: genuine softness. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. Jonathan smiled with the gentleness of someone who had walked this same path from fighting to loving. "Now you learn to walk with Jesus instead of using him for politics. Now you discover that loving enemies is stronger than defeating them." The transformation was visible. The hardness had left his face, replaced by the softness of someone who had finally stopped fighting. As the show came to an end, there was no fighting music, no call to action, no slogans, just the quiet awe of people who had witnessed something sacred. Charlie stood slowly, his legs shaky from the emotional earthquake he had just experienced. He looked out at his audience with new eyes, seeing them not as an army in a culture war, but as fellow travelers in need of the same love he had just received. "I don't know what this means for the organization, for my work, for anything," he said honestly, "but I know I can't go back to fighting the old way when I've just discovered Jesus didn't come to win, but to love." The admission was courageous, and the audience responded with gentle applause. Not the cheering of victory, but the respectful acknowledgement of truth. In the days that followed, Charlie made a decision that shocked the conservative world. He announced that he was changing Turning Point's focus from political fighting to community service. "I've been teaching people how to win battles instead of how to love neighbors," he said in a simple video message. "I've turned Jesus into a political symbol instead of following him as savior." The cost to his credibility was enormous. Many political allies turned their backs. But for the first time in years, Charlie experienced the peace that comes from aligning your life with the gospel instead of politics. 6 months later, a small news story appeared that most media outlets ignored. But that brought tears to Jonathan's eyes. Charlie had quietly started visiting children's hospitals. Not with cameras or publicity, but simply to sit with sick children and their families. He would read them stories, pray with them, and share the love he had found in Jesus. One of those children was Michael from Detroit, who had lived much longer than doctors expected and who told everyone that Mr. Charlie isn't angry anymore. He found Jesus who loves. The ripple effects of that day in the studio continued to spread, touching lives in ways that no political victory ever could. Charlie's transformation wasn't without cost. He lost political allies, conservative media platforms, and the adoration of those who preferred fighting Christianity over loving Christianity. But he gained something infinitely more valuable, a real relationship with the Jesus he had spent years using for political purposes. When asked about his dramatic change, he would simply say, "I thought I was serving God when I was winning for him. I discovered I serve him when I love like him." The simplicity of the statement belied the profound journey from fighting to loving that it represented. Today, both Jonathan and Charlie continue their work, but with a different foundation and a different purpose. Jonathan still portrays Jesus on screen, but with an even deeper understanding of the love he represents. Charlie still influences millions, but now he points them toward love instead of victory. Their encounter that day in the studio became a watershed moment, not just for them, but for everyone who witnessed it. A reminder that no one is too strong, too politically correct, or too far gone to experience the transforming power of authentic love. The video of their exchange has been watched over 500 million times. Not because it was sensational, but because it was real. In an age of political division and politicized Christianity, people hungry for truth recognized it when they saw it. Comments poured in from viewers around the world who said that watching Charlie's surrender gave them permission to surrender their own fighting and hatred. The most powerful testimony came from a veteran who wrote, "I saw the strongest culture warrior I knew admit he needed love. If Charlie can stop fighting and start loving, maybe I can too." The story of that day continues to ripple outward, changing lives in ways that no political victory ever could. Sometimes the most profound transformations happen not when we finally win the battle, but when we finally admit we've been fighting the wrong war. If this story stirred something in your heart, then perhaps it's time to ask the same question Charlie asked: what happens now? The answer is beautifully simple. You stop fighting your neighbor and start loving them. You stop seeking political victory and start seeking God's heart. You take the next step toward the one who never came to win the culture war, but to save souls. Arms open, grace ready, love unlimited. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.